All right. As I said, I have a very specific topic tonight and a timely one. There's a long-standing rabbinic pedagogy to teach davar yom biyomo, to teach about things when they are happening. So you teach about Rosh Hashanah when it's Rosh Hashanah time, and when it's a certain parsha, you teach about that parsha, right? Otherwise, you could teach about any parsha on any Shabbos, so long as you cover all of them, over the course of time. But we don't do that. When we're reading it, you preach about that parsha. When it's Pesach, you preach on the, halachot of Pesach. So I want to continue our look at some of the holiday liturgy by looking at the edition for Purim. Usually referred to traditionally just as Al Hanisim. Right? Sometimes you'll see in a calendar or in synagogues that have like little boards that tell you about the variations for that day's tefillot. It'll say Ad Al Hanisim, right? And they call it that because that's the first two words of the additional paragraph that we recite. Do you have your Siddurim? Because it's not in the digital one. So if you have you both have your Siddurim, good. So it's page 431. And actually, I want to turn back first to page 430 to back up a little bit and get a running start. There's actually two Al Hanisims. One for Chanukah and one for Purim. And they begin with the same intro, Al Hanisim ve'al hapurkan. We'll talk about that in a second. But why those two? What's Hanukkah and Purim share something?
Because they're not in the Torah.
Bingo.
No,
Right. They're not in the five books. They're not the Esther is in the Tanakh. It is, biblical, but it's not in the Torah. And Hanukkah is in what's called the Apocrypha. You know about the Apocrypha?
Mm-mm.
Okay. That's not anywhere in the Bible. Hanukkah is not mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, period. So, that's pretty unusual, right? Until you get to very modern holidays, like Yom HaAtzmaut, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and Israel Independence Day, etc. Until you get to our own lifetimes, these are the only two. It's really quite exceptional that there are two extra biblical holidays. And so they don't have a Musaf because Musaf is rooted in the biblical commandments for animal sacrifices, that you offer an additional sacrifice on those days, on Passover, on Shavuot, on Rosh Chodesh, on Yom Kippur, on Rosh Hashanah. All these are mentioned in Sukkot. Those are all mentioned in the Bible. But the others have no mitzvah to offer animal sacrifices on them. Right? There's no, God said to Moses on Purim, offer A, B, or C, because Moses was not alive then. So they're celebrated ritually, right? Lighting the menorah, reading the Megillah, and liturgically by adding these paragraphs to every Amidah during those days, during all of Hanukkah and for the day of Purim. The Apocrypha. So this is an example of a Christian Bible. And specifically, it's like the Church of England, right? It's Anglican Bible. Not all Christian Bibles include the books, they're apocryphal books or the Apocrypha, but they include books like the book of Maccabees. That's not in the Bible, but it is a book written in the time when all the other books of the Bible were written, but which never became a part of the official canon of the Bible. The first book of Maccabees. There's actually two books of Maccabees. The book of Judith. There's a book of Tobit. There's several other biblical books that aren't in the Bible. And they're referred to collectively as apocryphal books or the Apocrypha. And the Maccabees is there. That's kind of how we know anything about the Maccabees. And if you look at the Al-Hanisim, it doesn't exactly correlate with the books of the Maccabees. The books of the Maccabees are relatively secular books. They describe the actual battles of the Hasmonean family, Simon and Yochanan and Matityahu and all the heroes of the story. They're the heroes of the story, and the only reason we know about them is through these books, which, by the way, they were written by Jewish people. They're just not a part of the Jewish Bible. And they're not really a part of most people's Christian Bible. Protestants generally do not read and study the Apocrypha, unless only academically. If you look in a King James Bible, it's not in the King James Bible. They don't include that in there. So it's added to more academic Bibles and only in certain Christian churches. I'm not sure what all the doctrine that explains that is, but in the Talmud, there are a number of discussions about the canonization of books in the Bible. Like, it was a lively discussion back in the days of the Talmud, which books will be included and which ones will not be included. That was the subject of debate. It wasn't, handed down as here's this finished book of, 24 different books. And in fact, people argued that the book of Esther should not be included in the canon because it does not directly talk about God. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. The whole story happens and God is not a character in the Bible. So, they argued, like, how can you include a book that isn't, a book about God and Israel?
He came to say hello.
Hello.
Hello. That's nice. You're delivering too. That's nice. That's good
You're gonna
service.
study with us? Good. All right, we got another classmate.
So let's look at 431. I want to start with the Purim one. In this Siddur, they do not print the editions for Purim and Hanukkah in the body of the Amidah. Instead, they tell you to flip to page 430 and 431 so that they don't have to reprint this, 5 different times, that kind of thing. That's just a printing decision. But in daily Siddurim, for example, in the morning Siddur, the daily weekday Siddur, this one, it's usually in each of the Amidot. And you can see it's usually like on a page like this, where it says On Hanukkah add,
Yeah,
on Purim add,
Right.
on Yom Ha'atzmaut add,
yes.
right?
Mhm.
In the Hebrew and the English. So this is exactly what we're looking at also, but it's just printed separate from the Amidah, but it is added during the recitation of the Amidah. So in each of the services, you add this paragraph. And all right, Al Hanisim, for the miracles, and the Al Hapurkan, the deliverance or the redemption, the Al HaGevurot, for the strength. Gevura means strength or victories, right? The winning. The Al HaTeshuot, the salvations or triumphs. The Al HaMilchamot, and for the battles, the wars. She'asita lavotenu, which you, God, did for our ancestors. Bayamim hahem bazman hazeh. In those days, Yamim hahem. And there's actually, this is an interesting thing, you know, a vav, one letter can make a little bit of a difference, even theologically. So we say, probably you even recognize that song. Bayamim hahem bazman hazeh.
Mhm.
Right? It's part of the blessing for Hanukkah that we say, She'asita lavotenu bayamim hahem bazman hazeh. So zman means time, but it also means season, right? Time of year. So bayamim hahem bazman hazeh means in those days, way back when, during this time of year, meaning Adar, right? In the month, in this date, at this season, appointed time. So, but if you add ubazman hazeh, like they do in this Siddur, bayamim hahem, in those days, and in this time. Meaning miracles are not just ancient things that happen, they're also contemporary things. You, God, we thank you for the miracles and salvation and victory and battles that you won and fought for our ancestors, both in history and still to this day. That's a lot different than at this time of year in this season. That means that
What would it have said? What would it have said if it meant at this time of the year in this season?
it just would have said, instead of it, Bayamim hahem u vazman hazeh, like it does, it would just say Bayamim hahem bazman hazeh.
Mine has that. Okay.
It changes, zman hazeh means in this time.
Mhm.
And without that and, to contrast it to ancient history, it just means the time of year. But once you add that and you know, what are you're adding it to something. This and that. You can't, it's not just and that.
Mhm.
No, you can't have that. So once you add the and, it contrasts it with bayamim hahem, meaning, look, for a lot of people, it's easier to accept that God did miracles way back when. But he doesn't do them anymore
Mhm.
because we don't see them anymore. I mean, like, that's the thing, you know, if I haven't seen the kinds of miracles like are described in the Bible in my own lifetime. Now, I haven't lived, you know, forever, but long enough that you would think I'd have seen something like that. Talking donkey, right? Something. The sun standing still in the sky, a dead man being resurrected, a new growth coming from a stick that's disconnected from the ground, a dead stick. I mean, that's, you know, the earth opening up and swallowing up God's enemies. Boils, lice, right? So we don't have those.
Can you think of any?
Now, there's lots of people, we could have a very extensive discussion about the nature of miracles. And I think we have actually had that discussion. It's one of those words that everybody uses and thinks that everyone else means the same thing that they mean, but everyone means something different. We're all using the same word, but we all sort of mean something different by it. But if what you believe by miracles is the suspension of the natural order, through the intervening will of God, we don't generally see those. Now, some people will say, I saw a miracle, the birth of my child. Yes, right? I mean, okay, but now we're talking about something else. That's not the suspension of the natural order. That is the amazing wonder of the natural order. It's not the sun standing still in the sky. That's cataclysmic, the sun standing still in the sky. That's not the birth of a child. I mean, the birth of a child is something that happens every day. So yes, it is miraculous, but no, it is not a miracle in the meaning that they mean here. Now, however, you'll notice that so far, we have not talked about any specific miracles. We said miracles, we said battles, which, are not exactly miracles. And we've said that there's whatever happened for our ancestors also happened for us. If it was, well, we'll get to that. Okay, so Biyamei Mordechai Esther. And now we're going to give a summary of the story in one paragraph. This is how we commemorate, as we commemorate, we recall to our memory, and we sort of tell the story very quickly each time we say the Amidah. In the days of Mordechai and Esther, Bishushan Habira, in Shushan, the Persian capital city, Kishe'amad Alehem Haman Harasha, when the wicked, evil Haman stood up against them, rose against them, Bikesh Lahashmid, he desired, he wanted and plotted to destroy, to kill, Ule'abed, and to annihilate, at Kol HaYehudim, the entire Jewish people, Mina'ar ve'ad Zakein, from young to old, Taf ve'nashim, even infants and women, Bayom Echad, on a single day, Bishlosha Asar Lachodesh, Shneim Asar, to the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Thursday. Actually, tomorrow. It's Shushan Purim. Hu Chodesh Adar, that is in the month of Adar. Ushalalam Lavoz. And that all their goods were to be plundered, so that we would kill all the Jewish people, and then as a reward for killing them, you could go and take all of their stuff. So that's pretty much the story we know, and more or less the story as is told in the book of Esther. But you, ve'ata, you, capital Y, you means God, in your great mercy, you intervened, and you hefarta et atzato, you foiled his plot, right? You upset his wisdom, his plans. V'kilkalka et machshavato, it's a parallel kind of statement. You foiled his plot, you upset his plans, and you gave him what he deserved. V'hashevota lo gemulo berosho, and you visited upon his head what he deserved, and you hung him and his sons on the tree. Which is also pretty much the story. If you recall, Haman wants to destroy the Jewish people and take their stuff, but instead the Jewish people destroy him and also get to plunder the city. And and Haman and his sons are all either hung or impaled. It means one of those two things, either like, up on a stake or up on a noose, a gallows, but in some way killed and publicly, right? It's a public thing where you are put up for others to see your comeuppance. Now, I don't know what reactions, responses, any of that.
The impalement is gruesome.
Right.
Just thinking about that.
Yeah.
But that wasn't really a miracle.
Right.
No.
So that is a redemption, right? It's a teshua. They were redeemed. They were going to be killed.
Mhm.
And then in this, topsy-turvy thing, this everything is nahafoch, is turned upside down, where the guy who was on top is now on the bottom, and the guy who was on the bottom is now on the top. And it was a battle. There certainly was a battle. The last chapter describes, public chaos and the slaughter of thousands of people in Shushan. I mean, the story ends with triumphalism run amok and, really bad. It's very bad. And yeah, okay, we're happy that we weren't killed, but do we have to then run around and kill a bunch of other people? Right? It's all pretty ugly. The story is really horrifyingly ugly. I like to remind people, it's not a beauty contest. Right? Like, I don't know when that started being the way that we described what was going on, but I've watched beauty contests, and none of it is the kidnapping and, forced sexual slavery of hundreds of women by the king's guards for months on end, locking them away and subjecting them to torture. I mean, this is like really horrible story. Esther is not like the lucky winner of the, look at me with my crown. No. This is, it describes like really terrible stuff. And of course, on top of that, he's a brutal dictator, right? To do what he's doing and slaughter people throughout a kingdom and institute these malicious taxes and cruel viceroys and give them widespread leniency. I mean, it's terrible stuff. He's a gruesome caricature. So yeah, he threw a party. He didn't throw a party and have a beauty contest. Like, those are such there's such niceties. There's such euphemisms for it. No, I think it was, here it describes it better. He saw genocide, and he, violently kidnapped all the young women of the kingdom to, have his way with them and pick whichever one satisfied his weird fantasies the best.
So Esther was really putting herself not to be in a luxurious queen position, but part of the harem. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, hang on one second. Let's see if I have something here.
Maybe I won't dress up as Queen Esther.
Nice fish.
I've gone as Queen Esther before.
You have?
When I was a kid, my mom thought that was a hoot. She dressed me up one year in one of her bathing suits and all sort of like dolled up and, high heel shoes. Well, I think I was like 12. I don't know, it was, whatever. Anyways, I don't
That'd be calling it in drag.
Yeah. Well, that's a part of the tradition of Purim. is to turn things on their head. That's why we mock things on Purim. Why are you allowed to mock sacred things? We don't do that. We don't mock Torah. Never. Mock rabbis? You don't do that. Well, except on Purim. And then have at it. Because it's a way of acting out that upside downness. Right? That everything is confused, like, and drunk. It's like the drunkenness. The metaphor of the whole thing is to not know what's up, what's down, to be morally confused. Everything is confused.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's confusing is, as you said, Sue, how does Esther become queen? Right? The story describes that they kidnap all these young women, they forcibly take them to the capital city, and then this eunuch describes a eunuch who's in charge of these women. It's literally it's like a whorehouse where they make them up for 6 months. They have them sit in oil so their skin is soft, and they perfume them on end. And in other words, they abuse them to satisfy the particular whims of the king. And then every night, a different woman goes into the king. Right? So these are not like, nice visits where, hey, the king is very generous and a gentle lover. Okay? It says, Ba'erev hi ba'a, in the evening she came, and in the morning she left. And she would never go there again unless he asked for her again. So it's like one night, disposable. It's basically the women were disposable, prepped for 6 months. And then every evening he had a new, fresh, perfumed girl for his pleasure. And if he liked you and asked for your name by name back again, he might have you back again. But otherwise you were, disposed of and next. So why Esther? Well, she must have done something. What are Esther's? Mordecai is a man of faith and devotion. Moshe is a man of prophecy and will and courage. David is a man of skill and poetry and political savvy. Solomon, a man of wisdom. Deborah is a brave warrior and judge. What's Esther? She's just a kid, right? What did she do? She slept with the king and managed to, satisfy him that he wants her back, called her by name. She gets special privileges. She can approach him without being killed. She's a negotiator. She's a survivor. She manipulates him. She's a politician. She's a diplomat. She's right? She's clever. But a very different leader or savior than all the rest. Miracle? Is she the miracle? Are we the miracle now? Some argue that the book of Esther
God's
is a
intervention.
turning point.
So my husband says it's God's intervention.
Well, so some argue that the Esther is a turning point from the agency of God to the agency of people. And that to the extent that God shows up anywhere in this story, it is through people.
So he didn't really intervene. He gave her the strength and the skill to know what she needed to do. Well, that's intervening too.
Well, right. So, but it's a different way of thinking about intervening. It's turning some of it's a maturation of the of the child into a more responsible adult. That to a certain extent, we're more responsible for ourselves than we used to be. You know, when your kid is 12 and he shoplifts from the supermarket, they don't blame the kid, they blame you. But when he's 22 and shoplifts from the supermarket, they don't blame you, they blame him.
Mhm.
So there's a point at which we are no longer overtly intervened and saved by God. But then if you take the Ubazman Hazeh seriously, when they say, and in these days, what do they mean in the Siddur here? They mean Israel. That's what it means. That's why in the other book, the third prayer on the page is Yom Ha'atzma'ut, Israel Independence Day.
Mm.
And is that a miracle? Is every victory of the underdog against the cruel larger a miracle?
It's every one of
Purim,
David and Goliath.
Hanukkah, Purim, Yom Ha'atzmaut all share that in common. The idea of a small force able to overcome a much greater force. So great that it has to be the hand of God. You know the stories of Israel and of the incredible disproportionate odds. Just a few guys with just a few guns held off the tanks for a week in order. I mean, there's some stories like that, and they're real. Those things really happened. The Maccabees, they defeated the Greeks. That's like a part of history. That's pretty amazing.
Well, we're praying for that now.
Yeah,
Right.
right. Disproportionate warfare is miraculous. God favors the underdog.
Well, when we reflect on those stories, then it does give us hope today. For today, what we are actually seeing in our time. That's the hope we live on. Can that be repeated again? The David and Goliath story. I mean, what else do we have? Logic tells you that can't possibly be.
But yeah, I think that's very well said, and I think that is that idea that we stand up, the little guy against the big guy, is a big part of what these things are. And maybe what you're saying, Arlene, is that it is hope is miraculous in the face of overwhelming oppression. To believe that you can win is a deviation of nature, right? It's an upheaval of the natural order. You should curl up into a little ball and give up.
Right. It's unrealistic to have those hopes, but we've seen the realism of those hopes in these stories. So it's a weird juxtaposition.
And maybe that's why God gave us the miracles in the past, so that we would have hope when we're confronted in situations again, to know that it happened before it could happen again. Maybe that's the whole reason for miracles in the past.
Well, I like what both of you just said. I mean, it's Sue, I have a friend here, Dr. Marshall Duke. He teaches at Emory University. You may know him or some of his family. They're very active in the Jewish community here. They were members of my synagogue. Anyways, he's a psychiatrist by formal training, and but part of his field of study in psychology is resilience. And he talks about how the telling the one factor that's like common amongst all resilient people is that they heard stories of resilience. That not that they heard your grandfather was a big macher. That doesn't do anything, right? But that you heard your grandfather was a big macher, and then he lost everything, and then he climbed his way back out. That makes you resilient, that you hear stories that others can be resilient. And I do think that spirit of hopefulness is, I mean, that tracks out of the Passover story. It's clearly true of the Hanukkah story. And I think it's true of much of the told history of the War of Independence in Israel, and many of its battles for survival. And I think it's, I even think it's true just on a personal level. I can kind of relate to it as a martial artist, where you have to expect that the other person will be stronger than you in order to really, truly train well. You can't think, I'm going to be the big guy and they're going to be the little guy. Because, well, first of all, because little guys never pick on big guys, right? That doesn't happen. Big guys pick on little guys. That's how it happens. And so you have to recognize your own vulnerability and have the conviction that I might not win, but there's no way you're going to win. Right? Like, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. Like, and that's, to me, that's very inspiring. It really is. And maybe in some ways that spirit is what they're getting at, Arlene, is for the will to do these things, because of course, Esther and Mordecai had to do something. They didn't just sit there. This wasn't just the splitting of the sea, you know, like where you didn't have to do anything. All salvations require the initiative of the person who's in them. Yeah.
So they had the sechel to figure out the plot.
Right. Yeah. And the determination, I think, to survive. It's a survival story, in much the same way as the Hanukkah one, which I want to look at in 1 second. I'm reminded of a story I like to share. One of the other grown-ups in our Taekwondo school was a well-known cancer surgeon here at Emory Hospital in Atlanta, Dr. Khoury, and he died of cancer, sadly, a number of years back. He was a very talented martial artist. He was a high-degree black belt, a surgeon, a Lebanese Christian by birth and raised in France, and educated early education in France. So he was like fluent in Arabic and in French and in English and it's probably several other languages. Anyways, he trained Taekwondo with us. And we were talking one day. You know, I at the time I wore a big kippah all the time, and he knew who I was, blah, blah, blah. We were talking about, you know, did I ever get hassled wearing the kippah? I said, you know, sometimes. And I said, actually, more often than not, I'm mistaken for Muslim than I am for Jewish. People are harassing me. They're probably harassing me because they think I'm Muslim, not because they think I'm Jewish. And he was like, I can relate because he's Arab, right? But he's Christian Arab. And like, you know, in France, the skinheads don't care, you know, what your religion is. You're Arab, you're Arab. So he tells me the following story. He said, yeah, once when I was in medical school, he was a Taekwondo student back then. He was one of those guys who studied, became a black belt as a young person, and then drifted away for a number of years and came back. He said, I was on the subway in Paris late at night, and I was surrounded by 4 skinheads, big boots, skinheads, the whole thing, European white supremacists, Nazi types. Hey, punk, what are you? Who are you? Why are you in our country? Get out of here, you scumbag, blah, blah, blah. He said, then they got serious and they start closing in on me. And one of the guys says, we're going to kill you. You're going to die tonight. Something like that. And he said, Hillel, I don't know what it was. I'm not that tough. But I looked him right in the face. I said, I'm not going to be the only one. Right? And he was like, and I was ready. Like, I was like gearing up, and they spooked and they took off. Because he stood up to them and he said, all right, you really, if this is the day I'm going to die, I'm going to kill 1 or 2 of you, bleep, bleep, also on the way out. And I'm always impressed by that story, both because it's a very badass kind of story, but also because it has that kind of spirit of determination.
Kind of like Clint
Yeah, I'm not going to give in. I'm not going to give up. You're going to have to, yeah.
Mhm.
Isn't that a great story? Yeah,
Mhm.
he was a great guy. I really, I miss him, and he was inspiring. Anyways, turn back 1 page. Let's go to Hanukkah. The other story of oppression and religious cruelty. It seems people have a real hunger deep within them for religious bigotry and hatred. Here too, we start with in the days of. In the days of Matityahu, Mattathias, the son of Yochanan, the Hasmonean, the high priest, and in the days of his sons, when the cruel Greek kingdom rose to rule over your people, very similar to what we said about Purim, when the evil Haman rose up to annihilate your people, and to violate the way of life you desired for them, demanding that they forget your Torah, right? That was one of the impositions of the Greeks, was a prohibition on the public teaching of Torah, and on a number of other principal Jewish practices. Again, you fought their battles. But of course, it wasn't God with the sword. With the Maccabees tells about Simon with the sword. You championed their cause, avenged their wrongs. Just like in the other story, you foiled his plot and you overturned his plans. And you delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, and the evildoers into the hands of the righteous, the arrogant into the hands of those engaged with your Torah. That's a number of different ways of saying the same thing over and over again, with a slightly different color on each and every one of the comparisons between the Hasmoneans and the Greeks. And thus your name was glorified and made holy. And Israel, your people, achieved deliverance and a great victory. The same 2 kinds of words, Teshua and Purkan. And it's interesting, we listen to exactly how this is worded here. After the victory, right now, we haven't heard anything about the oil or the temple or the lamp or anything, right? We've only heard about the military victory. You delivered the big army into the hands of the little army. Afterwards, your children entered the Holy of Holies emptied your house of idols, right? We retook the temple, took out the idols that the history books tell us the Greeks put in the temple, purified the sanctuary, right? Cleaned everything up and made sure everything was kosher, and kindled lights in the court, and set aside 8 days of Chanukah, of rededication, to give thanks and to celebrate your great name. To give thanks for what?
The victory.
The victory. And just as the victory made a great name for God, we would also, say God won the war, and make this a celebration of God and God's victory for us. What's not in this paragraph?
The oil.
There's no oil. There's no menorah. There's none of that. It
There's
does
no water.
say,
There's-
it says they lit lights in the courtyard, in the chatzer. Right? So they lit a light. Right? Maybe it's the Ner Tamid, maybe it was the menorah, maybe it's something else. And they did dedicate 8 days. But the book of Maccabees doesn't say 8 days because of the miracle of the oil. The book of Maccabees does not mention the miracle of the oil at all. There's no miracle of the oil in the book of the Maccabees. No oil whatsoever. They choose 8 days because the most recent holiday before Hanukkah would have been what?
Simchas Torah.
Right, but that means what? What Simchas Torah is really the end of Sukkot,
Right.
right? On the 8th day, Shemini Atzeret, Simchas Torah. So on the 8th day, so the immediate previous holiday would have been Sukkot, Simchas Torah, Shemini Atzeret, 8 days. So they model Hanukkah explicitly on the 8 days of Sukkot. 7 plus 8. Because that was the most recent one that they hadn't been able to celebrate in the sanctuary. So they were like, well, we've cleaned the whole place up and whatnot, so let's have those 8 days of rededication of the temple. That's according to the book of Maccabees. The oil is only recorded in the Talmud. All I'm saying about, I'm not trying to be too, say there's no Santa Claus, but there is no Santa Claus. And sorry if you're Christian, you're watching this later on, and I'm really sorry for that, especially if you're a young person.
Forgot he's recording it.
Yeah.
The secret is out.
Yeah, the secret is out. That's right. Talk to me later about other myths that I can possibly upend. But my only point in bringing all that up is to say that the paragraph that we add for Hanukkah doesn't talk about it. I don't care what you want to think about what happened back then. The liturgical way that we commemorate it is to commemorate the historic victory and to recognize that the victory in battle, we see that as the triumph of God and God's salvation of us.
You've totally burst my bubble, Rabbi.
That's what it means to be a master. A master means you have to know the underlying mechanics.
But we teach in Sunday school. We teach the miracle.
Yeah.
They'll teach that.
So why do we do that?
I don't know anymore.
I think there's ways to do that without. I don't like lying to kids. Okay, but pedagogy can embrace deception, and when you're doing something in a particular way, it's okay to lie a little bit. We had a running thing with our kids that Joanna's car was a flying car. And that there were a certain combination of buttons that you could press that would make it a flying car, but that we couldn't do it because it was like against the rules in Atlanta, that kind of thing. And we stuck with that lie for, like into their teenage years when they knew we were lying for many years already. So there's a value to that. Okay, right? That's not what I'm talking about. Santa Claus, that's perfectly fine. You want to teach your kid about Santa Claus? But then there is a point where maintaining the myth, maintaining the fairy tale, undermines rather than builds. When you're very young, mythical thinking makes sense, and it is the way it's true. It's like fairy tales. It's always the evil stepmother, right? That's because that resonates and it's true. What is it? I'm going to blank on the name of the book on Bruno Bettelheim's The Uses of Enchantment. He's an early founding psychology founder of psychology, Bruno Bettelheim. He wrote a book called The Uses of Enchantment, and it explores fairy tales and how fairy tales convey truths that young people experience, children experience, in a way that they can say it. Like the incredible overbearing power of parents. I mean, imagine if you're the little baby. Parents we're giants and we're incredibly powerful. We're magically powerful. We make all kinds of incredible magical stuff happen. So there's a reason why stories, make it that way. The king and the evil father king, right? And the wicked stepmother, right? I mean, don't be offended by this. This is a natural use of these kinds of stories to help kids process things that they don't have language for.
Well,
so
how did the 8 days get into the Talmud?
I don't know exactly, but I'll tell you the running theory is more or less that you have to remember when things were written, right? That the book of Maccabees is written most likely around near the time of the Battle of the Maccabees. It tells of their victory. So they must sort of, be in ascendancy. People who write the books are the victors. By the time the rabbis, 2 or 3 centuries later, are living in Roman-occupied Palestine, they're completely powerless. The Hasmonean dynasty has all but disappeared, and the Greeks are no longer there, and the Romans have placed a battalion on the Temple Mount and built a giant fortress there. And they're much more organized and brutal than the Greeks. So we're not so tough anymore. And now going around and telling stories about how we, toppled the big bad occupier, well, that's not very popular. So now we tell stories about the miracle of the oil. The Talmud does not mention the military victories. The book of Maccabees goes into, the book of Maccabees is studied by military strategists because it talks about how to attack superior forces, right? The valleys and the hills and here, and the Greeks used elephants. They had armored elephants as sort of like tanks. And it describes how Simon runs up underneath one of them and punctures him with the spear up underneath because that's where there's no armor. I mean, that's like, it describes extensive military strategy of the little guy defeating the big guy. And the thinking is that the rabbis were uncomfortable with this, with the military aspect of it, with the rebellion aspect of it, with the throwing off the yoke of the oppressors. That brought all kinds of terrible stuff on them. And so then instead of telling that story, they told a different story, which was one that takes place strictly in the sanctuary. It's strictly God's miracle. It's one of faith and light and hope and vulnerability. Both are true. How about that? Right? Aren't they? In a certain way, that's really true. We try to share with our kids miracle. I don't know. I didn't want to raise our kids with magical thinking beyond the time when enchantment has its uses. But once they can really know and understand the world as it is, I didn't want them to think that the world works by magic, because I don't believe it does. And but I also wanted them to be enchantable, to recognize that you can't explain everything, and that sometimes things are just wondrous and amazing and absolutely incredible, and we don't have to explain them. And just because we can't explain it doesn't mean we have to explain it with magic. We can just dwell in not knowing, and that's okay. It's actually quite wonderful to not know everything and then to seek to know more, and to not assume that things that might, even don't assume things that might seem magical are. Maybe they can really happen, right? People have reported all kinds of stuff. I'll tell you an interesting story. Here's a magic angel intervention story. Happened to Joanna, my wife. She was driving out of New York City and to catch a flight out of Newark, New Jersey, and was going to be late. And if she missed the flight, the person she was traveling with was going to go without, wouldn't have something else. I mean, it was going to be a total catastrophe, and that kind of rushed, terrible thing. And she gets pulled over by a police officer just before the tunnel going out of the city, and he's totally hassling her, not letting her go. And then he basically says, I'm gonna have your car towed. Right? It was like a out-of-date tag or out-of-date inspection, something like that, that she had sent it in, but she didn't get it back. And it was just like a bureaucratic administrative thing. And he was being a real hard ass about it. And he was going to like hold her there and impound her car. And she's like, oh my God, you cannot do this. I'm on my way to the airport. Like, no. And in fact, the mayor had just, as part of like a whole easing of police harassment of citizens for small infractions, had passed a number of things, including no more impounding of cars for past due administrative something or others. And so Joanna's like, no, in fact, just last week, the mayor, and the guy was like, sorry, lady, no way. He's writing up the ticket. Once I started writing up the ticket, you're out of it, right? Just then, a limo pulls up behind her. And out of the limo steps out a woman dressed like, Wall Street, world killer, right? Beautiful business, gorgeous business, like all put together thing, talking on a cell phone, even way back then, talking on a cell phone, et cetera. She's like, she asked the officer something, doesn't even talk to Joanna, or asked Joanna, is he hassling you? Something, and she's like, yeah, he won't let me go, and something. And I told him the mayor, and he said, lady, look, don't tell me what to do. I'm the police officer here, and I don't know, get back in your car, lady. And she hands him the phone the police officer the phone. She says, you know, talk to this guy. He's like, yes, okay, yes, sir. And his face goes all, you know, yes, sir, yes, okay, sir. Hands her the phone back,
Mayor.
and turns to Joanne and says, "You can go, ma'am." And Joanna's like, what just happened? And she turns around to like say thank you to this woman, and the woman's gone. Back in her car, gone, disappeared. Who knows who she was, who was on the phone, whatever it was.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know. Right? I don't know. Neither does Joanna. She's like, I don't know who this was. Like, she's an angel. An angel came down and interfered because I needed it and put the police chief on the phone. I like, who was, I don't know. So things do happen, and the enchantment of life is not to be minimized, but it's also not to be whisked away with very convenient magic thinking, Santa Claus and Tooth Fairy stuff. That's fine for children's stories, because all children's stories are fantastical, because children are live in a fantasy world. Once that is not true, then better real thinking.
Well, if you're interested, we have a daughter who is having difficulty conceiving. And she prayed and she prayed and she did this and she did that, went to doctors and whatnot. And she was going home from work and she was so exasperated. She just prayed. She said, God, if I'm not supposed to conceive, just let me know, but give me some kind of sign. She turns the corner and there's a double rainbow that she sees. And she called us. We were in Hawaii and we had just gone up to Haleakala, which is the volcano there. And she's telling us the story. And we look up and there's a double rainbow. She conceived of twins.
That's pretty cool.
For her, that was God's sign that she was doing the right thing. Keep doing what you're doing. It's going to
Yeah,
happen.
that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
The more is known in this world than in your books, Horatio, right? Or something like that. I'm sure I'm butchering that quote. Yeah. Very interesting story.
All
Look,
right.
just that there are 1,000 scientists and physicians who worked together to figure out how conception works and to overcome obstacles to conception. Think about that. I mean, that is, to my grandparents, that would have seemed miraculous. That would have been magic. They can do what? They can take a drop out of one of them and a drop out of the other and mix them together in something separate and then put it back into the woman and she'll make a child. I mean, that's the stuff of fantasy. Somebody thought that up, a person out of the blue created that out of nothing. That's pretty incredible.
Because
So
they had
even-
to believe that it could be. You know, you have to believe. Well, I think it's incredible too, but you have to have that belief that
Right, that visual.
there's a
that
way.
visual
There
vision.
is a way. We just got to find it. Yeah.
That's right.